Welcome, my name is Jack Lewis. I'm the Executive Director at One for the World, and we are an organisation who asks people to pledge 1% of their income to the most effective charities working in global health and poverty. It is a terrible fact that nearly every day, nearly 15,000 children under the age of 5 are killed by poverty. So that's nearly 15,000 children under the age of 5 who die because they don't have enough water to drink, or the water that they have to drink is not of good enough quality. They don't have enough food to eat, or the food they have is not of good enough quality. Or most commonly, they contract a disease which is 100% preventable or 100% treatable, but they just do not have the resources, either not to get sick in the first place or to get better once they are sick. We are the first generation who have an opportunity to do something about that and be really, really confident in the way that we address it. Because we are the first generation where, thanks to the work of pioneering development economists, we can say with high confidence which interventions will actually work to save lives in the developing world. And One for the World offers people the opportunity to take advantage of that by making a small, affordable, regular gift to the very best charities working in global health and development. So if you're interested in knowing more about that and potentially giving a very, very small amount of money that will go a huge way, we will post a link in the chat to our donation page, and you can find out more on our website, and we'll also be asking you later in the webinar if you'd like to hear more, and we will follow up with you at that point. But now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Chloe Cockburn to this webinar. Chloe leads Open Philanthropy's strategy for investing in criminal justice policy and practice reforms to substantially reduce incarceration while maintaining public safety. Prior to joining Open Phil, she oversaw state policy reform work for the ACLU's campaign to end mass incarceration. And before that, she worked with the Vera Institute and the civil rights law firm of Neufeld, Scheck and Bruston, and clerked for Judge Sifton of the Eastern District of New York. And the reason that we asked Chloe to join us is because obviously every single part of certainly the One for the World universe, and indeed most of the world, was touched in a very profound way by the death of George Floyd earlier this year. And we saw mass mobilization of protests, such as I don't think we've seen really before, although Chloe will talk more about that. And it posed a lot of questions, I think, for us personally, but also for us as an organization, about how we think about social justice movements within effective giving, and also about how we should respond to the Black Lives Matter protests, particularly relevant to One for the World, because many of our volunteers are students who were incredibly passionate in their response to those events. So with that context in mind, Chloe, welcome. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
That's a pleasure. So the first question, just to get us started, could you give us a brief introduction to your work at Open Phil?
Sure. And hi, all of you invisible people from around the world. Florida, Sweden, Brooklyn, Berlin, London, and other places. It's very cool. I'm calling in from New York, where I've worked remotely for the just over 5 years that I've been with Open Philanthropy. And I come to this as a lawyer by training who spent several years doing litigation and policy work on what it called the sort of the inside game of the movement ecosystem. And I may refer to the ecosystem throughout this back and forth. I did a brief article on that topic for the Stanford Social Innovation Review. So it's the only thing I've actually published. Since being on this job, I've been doing other things, but SSIR, Chloe Coburn, you can see my little piece on movement ecology, which might interest you. But anyways, I came up in the inside game and experienced a lot of frustration with realizing that the limits of doing just work from just that perspective, you know, at the ACLU helping with state policy in various states, and realizing that you could have great ideas, be right on the policy, even know who to talk to, you didn't have really the leverage to make something happen that wasn't going to happen otherwise. The people who were sympathetic might say, I'd love to help you, but I can't. And people who were unsympathetic were like, I don't have to talk to you at all and you can't make me. So coming into Open Philanthropy, a big focus of my interest in thinking about how do we move good policy and practice was thinking about how to create more leverage. And a lot of that has meant funding organizing. So millions and millions of dollars from this portfolio have gone towards organizing work. A lot of it clustered, basically almost all at the county level. In the US, for those of you in other countries, I'll briefly say criminal justice and many matters it's really, when we say a local issue, and also in the US, the government is really, what's the word? I don't know, fragmented, federalized, let's say, into the states, but also into the counties. And so much happens on the county level that's not even within the reach of the federal government to directly influence. And so you kind of have to go place to place across this vast country, from county to county, including really enormous counties like Los Angeles is our biggest one, has 10 million people, the size of Portugal. So I've been really drawn to that local county level work, focusing on the organizing and increasing the pressure to allow there to be real room for good policies to gain some traction. And then we funded a lot of, different sorts of things, always interested in, high leverage, high return on investment types grants to what we see as effective leadership. I'll say the field has changed a lot since we came in 5 years ago. In some good ways. I think there's still lots and lots of room for high marginal returns work to be done in this field. And what else can I say as kind of brief intro? The other thing I'll say, because we just had a lot of success at the ballot box this week, both in terms of electing candidates and in passing measures, some things we invested in, other things that are just out in the field. Someone in the chat mentioned drug policy, huge gains, multiple marijuana legalization in like South Dakota and New Jersey and 2 other states, a decriminalization of all drugs in Oregon, new district attorneys elected in multiple places, including Los Angeles, which is a very, very big deal. And we worked hard to make that happen. But this movement as a political movement, is a movement that has any kind of pull in the political sense, has only been going for about 5 years. Understanding that some important ballot measures on drug policy happened before 5 years ago, but in terms of the sort of oomph coming, that cavalry has been about 5 years. So it's quite young, and it's been really cool to be in at the ground floor of that. And there's a lot more room for things there. So I'll stop there because I don't want to sort of consume the whole conversation with just kind of background on our strategy. We do have a strategy document on the website. I haven't intensively updated it in a while, but the bones are still good. And so check it out if you're interested.
Fantastic. That's a great introduction, Chloe. Thank you. I wanted to ask you, I was going to get to this a little bit later, but you used the phrase inside game there, which I wasn't familiar with until I started reading a bit more about your view of kind of movement building. But am I right that inside game is trying to work sort of within the political system to try to create change? So maybe trying to convince parties to change their platform, or individual prosecutors or attorneys general or whatever to change the way they approach criminal justice. But you have actually sort of worked on the, if you like, the outside game, which is mass mobilization. And then it seemed like last week that paid off with some of the inside game, because a lot of, I saw a Twitter thread of a lot of progressive prosecutors and DAs and stuff being elected. Is that a fair summary of how that has kind of gone this year?
Yeah, I would distinguish the outside game, roughly speaking, to have 2 constituent parts. One part is structure-based organizing. So organizations with a membership and a distinct set of people who are gonna, you could say my base of whatever for the jurisdiction you're talking about wants this, so you should do that, as distinct from mass mobilization, which is, it's in the air, people are marching, they're not all part of one organization. You couldn't actually tell them to do anything or to use certain words or not use certain words, as much people have been talking about with frustration. But there's 2 importantly distinct things, which again, I talk about in the SSIR article. I'd also say the inside game, the way I think about them is, what is the source of your power? So a litigator, even if they're challenging the way things are going, is playing an inside game, because they're using existing laws and existing institutional structures to achieve certain aims, versus pushing from, to change those things from a different sort of position. What's the source of the power? Is it a base, or is it about using the current levers and infrastructures on the inside to get what you want?
Great, that's really helpful context, I think. I have quite a few more questions about where you think the direction of travel is here, particularly in light of last week. But I think it would be useful to start off with, just to give some context. Could you lay out the sheer scale of incarceration in the US and maybe run us through some of the numbers and why this is such a big problem?
Yeah, I want to weave that question in with the fact that, of course, the elephant in the room here is that your organization is focusing on giving to sort of alleviate poverty. And of course, a dollar goes a lot further in Bangladesh or, Uganda or wherever than in the US. So why am I even on this call? Except for the fact that Open Philanthropy is an EA inflected organization. And I think, I'd say there's other people that could argue this more eloquently than I could, but the reach of this system is very broad, very connected to poverty in the US. And also it's a very high leverage moment, very tractable moment right now to change, which could impact a lot of people in the US all at once and actually create the possibility to address the fact that, there's incredibly high rates of child poverty in the US, for example. And a lot of those kids, if you look at them and their families, you're going to see a criminal justice experience in that family. I would guess it's a huge, huge percentage. It's been this kind of unacknowledged force that has driven so many of the problems that people have tried to address in other ways, whether you're talking about homelessness, whether you're talking about low-income women and how they're sort of not progressing on track, or whether you're talking about intergenerational poverty in certain areas of the country, and particularly with respect to intergenerational poverty or sort of wealth gap with respect to Black people in the US. So this infrastructure, criminal justice system really impacts a lot of that. So there's roughly 1 in 3 Americans we think has a criminal conviction. And I will say, by the way, the data is so bad. So people have given it a good try, but there's a lot we don't know. So roughly 1 in 3 have a criminal conviction. Roughly 1 in 4 women have a loved one who's incarcerated. So to give you a sense of the impact beyond just like who's actually in prison. So there's, COVID has really affected things, but generally speaking, 1.3-ish million people in prison and another 700,000-ish or 800,000-ish in jails on a given day. There's a lot of churn. So people might spend like 2 weeks in jail or a couple days in jail. So there's millions of people who churn through jail a year, but if you just take a snapshot, it's about that size. And then, as many may be familiar, there's sort of racial disparities are really extreme. Like the lifetime prospect of a person ending up in prison is much, much higher for Black men, for example, than white men. There's also a huge class dimension. And so one can look up, Sentencing Project, for example, would have a lot of these statistics and things like that. But a lot of what I try to get people to understand is that it's not just who's in a jail or a prison, but it's also their kids, their families, their neighbors, their communities. When you have this hyper incarceration, there's a phrase called $1 million blocks that a great researcher and policy wonk named Eric Cadora came up with years ago to talk about. At the time, $1 million was a lot of money, where governments were spending $1 million a year to incarcerate people on one block. And imagine if you just invested $1 million straight into that block, what could you do? Now it would be a much larger number per block in the most incarcerated blocks. So it's more than just the individuals. It's a kind of pervasive cloud that impacts people's mobility and also their sort of relationship to the government and their communities. It's a real downer to have negative experiences with the criminal justice system. And there's been research done. I don't think it's, RCT level standards like clear solved, but there has been research done on the sort of depressing effect on political participation of any contact with the criminal justice system, even just a negative encounter with police, let alone being arrested, let alone being convicted, and so on and so forth. So it's if you think about what we were just watching the election the past week, in addition to voters who are disenfranchised for having a conviction, just that aura of that sort of depressed political participation and what effect it has. So I argue that it's much bigger than even the quite large number of people who are directly affected.
Yes, I think I'm really pleased you brought that up, Chloe, because there might be people on here wondering why we chose this topic in particular, given that we have such a strong focus on health and development. But there are, first of all, because we would like to give our members access to content that isn't just us talking about the same themes over and over again, but also because I think there are lots of similarities in the idea that a small intervention at the right point can have very profound consequences. So something that we're fond of referencing in global health and poverty is that if you deworm a child, they will still be earning more than children who weren't dewormed 20 years later. Well, it certainly seems plausible, if not probable, that if you can reduce contact with the criminal justice system for children, for families, for you know, even for offenders, when they're young, that you can try to break out of what could clearly become quite a vicious cycle. And I was interested reading in some of your research the kind of connectedness between poverty, contact with the criminal justice system, housing, all these different factors, education, all these different factors that seem interconnected. And so if you see someone who is struggling, it's hard to say, well, which, you know, where did the problem start in that kind of ecosystem?
Yeah, I think that's right. There's negative effects all the way downstream, including that kids with an incarcerated parent are much more likely to be incarcerated themselves and have worse health outcomes and so on. It's definitely a doom spiral.
A doom spiral, yes. Been doing lots of doom scrolling recently in the context of the election, so we can add doom spiral into the new words of 2020.
Indeed.
So we've already got some great questions coming in, and one of them goes straight to the heart of one of the things I want to talk about, which is the Black Lives Matter protests.
Yes.
So could you talk a little bit about the impact that there has been on your work? Because I know your work has been cited a lot in the effective giving community with the Black Lives Matter process that we've seen this year. So what's it been like in your world in 2020?
Well, it's interesting when Ferguson won, or Ferguson had a huge impact on the work back in, was it 2014? Because it gave this sort of breadth of public attention and focus that had been lacking. There had always been people working away, but it hadn't really risen to the fore, this issue of criminal justice, understanding that Ferguson, you know, these things are, what is it about policing? Is it about race in America? What is it about, you know, there's a whole cluster of sort of related things going on there, but that gave us a huge boost of urgency, of attention, of people forming new organizations and so on. And then it dissipated, and a lot of people were like, bummer, we could have done more. And I guess moving on to sort of do other sorts of things. When George Floyd was killed and murdered, I should say, and the protests happened, I thought, gosh, of course this was going to happen again, because it's inevitable. The way the structures have been set up, Black people are being killed constantly by police in these encounters where anyone looking at it would just be horrified because it looks so trivial. What, a counterfeit bill? And he's crushed to death on the street while people are watching. Now, this has been happening all the time, but it's just, you know, there's enough of those instances that one of them is going to catch. And I felt a bit silly for not anticipating that we would get it again. I don't know how much that would have changed about my strategy, but once it happened, it felt inevitable that it would have happened. But the scope and intensity of the public protests, I saw a New York Times article had estimated 15 to 25 million. So I'll call it 20 million-ish people in the streets this summer. Of course, amplified by the fact that people were home, desperate to get out of their houses. And there was a lot of sort of seething resentment and frustration and fear and anger around Trump. So all of that created this kind of pressure cooker over the summer. The effect has been, I would say, in places that had infrastructure that had built, and many places that we had funded had that infrastructure, they really took that oxygen and move forward. You know, the way a sort of a fire, you know, when you open the door in the stairwell and the air comes in, whoo, and it gets much bigger. That's what it felt like in a place like Los Angeles, which is really significant. In places without that sort of infrastructure, it like blows through and then is kind of gone. And this is the important distinction again between structure organizing and mass mobilization. You have to, the mobilization creates so much energy of public attention. It's a must, number one top priority, must talk about topic, But what will we do with that energy depends on the infrastructure. So it gave a lot of oxygen to people who had been preparing and working and were ready to move. It also unlocked a lot of dollars, which is great. I don't know if anyone's calculated the amount of money that got given away this year, but it was a lot. A bunch of it probably could have been lit on fire. A bunch of it probably went to stuff that was good and, you know, good job, but isn't actually going towards the problems that we're talking about. But there was some good capital that went towards things that I think are really productive. And it also, I think, at least in Los Angeles, I think it really had an impact on shaping up the election. Again, George Gascon just beat Jackie Lacey. I'll just take a moment to help you understand, because you may never have heard of these people. What are we talking about? You may never think about LA. LA, 10 million people the size of Portugal, has one district attorney who is elected, who decides who gets charged, who doesn't get charged, you know, what is the policy for that office. It's the largest jail in the country, and therefore I think it's probably must be in the world. Pre-COVID, about 17,000 people. It's down several thousand. We assume it'll go back up again. 1 in 3 California prisoners comes from Los Angeles, and California is the second most incarcerated state in the country. So it's a big deal. But dislodging an incumbent is really, really hard if they haven't had some terrible scandal. So when George Gascon started to run, people thought, well, that's never going to happen. Good job that he's doing it, but it's going to be impossible. And a lot of things broke in the right way this year, including the uprisings really gave focus to the fact that, well, Black Lives Matter is actually, you might not realize, extremely popular in Los Angeles. And I think in a lot of parts of the country, it scores higher than a lot of other things. And they had been targeting the incumbent Jackie Lacey for a long time, saying she's a real problem. And suddenly 1,000 extra people were showing up to camp outside Jackie Lacey's house and say, what are you doing? This is a problem. So added all these people, these volunteers, this attention. This was really helpful. Again, fortune favors the prepared. So this year, all that attention and energy really helped people who had already been on the move. And I think in other places, again, just blew through and didn't change that much in particular places that hadn't had that stuff set up. This is why I'm really intent on investing in leadership and vision that it is going to both achieve incremental things along the way, but also be prepared should the sort of public attention and energy really spike, that they can get things done in that moment.
Yeah, so I think you kind of alluded to this earlier, but you said because Black Lives Matter is a mass movement and doesn't have a kind of single controlling body, it may sometimes choose words that can be controversial or phrases. And we have a question from the audience about this from Maggie, who says, what do you think about the movement to defund the police, and what effect can that have on mass incarceration?
So first of all, I'd say a lot of people have expended a lot of mental energy and breath on having opinions about these words, and they are what they are. I mean, there's no place you can go to edit the words, you know, you can't, you know, it's in decentralized mass movement, like there's no one person who's a standard bearer who can make these decisions. That is the thing that caught on. The second thing I'd say is that people within this work are very suspicious of phrases that can be easily rendered meaningless. So many have said, why not say reform the police? Why not say safe communities? And it's like, well, what the hell does that mean? In Minneapolis, there had been a lot of police reform. DOJ had gone in and spent a lot of time there. They'd had lots of trainings, lots of stuff, and still George Floyd was smothered to death on the street. So police reform doesn't necessarily get you very much. Defund the police, as I take it, is an intentionally concrete and clear statement to say we need to see less dollars going to these harmful institutions. The second tagline might be defund the police, you know, reimagine communities or invest in communities. Because of course, which you may not know, I mean, even with when COVID was hitting earlier this year and the uprising shifted this a little bit, cities and states were on track to cut everything in their budgets, housing, you know, care for young mothers, like food programs, all of these things, but increase the police budget. And, you know, what's that about? Why is this top priority? Why does this agency eat first? And so there was pressure put on that in June to say, no, we can't be like increasing the police budget while we're decreasing all the things that if you properly funded, you wouldn't actually have people going into the criminal justice system. So that's the second thing I'll say. The third, yeah, oh, go ahead.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to stop you.
No, go ahead.
Well, just that there's a connected question here from Neil, which was also something I wanted to bring up with you. And he said, the Black Lives Matter movement seems to be strongly associated with the left. And I think that partisan divide really crystallized around defund the police during the election this year. And he asks, has that made passing legislation in this area harder, do you think?
You know, I asked this question to one of our grantees who's a super conservative guy. I was like, where are we at? You know, are things getting much harder in the state legislatures? And he's saying no, he still thinks that there's appetite. He hasn't seen it. I mean, I don't know, extra nerdy people may know this, but in McConnell's closing argument, some video he did for why the Republicans should keep the Senate, I don't remember what the first 2 points were, but the third and last point was criminal justice reform. You know, Trump was big on the First Step Act. Republicans are trying to claim they're good on criminal justice reform in part because they wanted to peel off black male voters. They worked hard to cast Kamala Harris as the worst incarcerator that's ever lived. And while some may critique her policies when she was in office, and I have done, she's not the worst incarcerator who'd ever lived. That is not true. Bill Barr, our thankfully outgoing head of DOJ, is truly monstrous in that regard, and even wrote, I don't know, in the 80s or 90s, like, we need more incarceration. Mass incarceration is fantastic. Anyways, so I think it's still up for grabs, you know, that there's like, and there's a lot of sort of incoherent kind of positions in this space, which can be frustrating, but also helpful because it stops things getting so locked in that you can't actually move. So someone might say, down with Black Lives Matter, but yes to criminal justice reform, even though those things may seem like, well, if you're for one, why aren't you for the other? Yeah, how did Black Lives Matter show up in the elections? I'd also say, I mean, there's a lot of hand wringing and like, you know, post-game analysis right now about what happened in the down ballot races. And I will say that, again, criminal justice ballots, whether ballot measures or elections, went very well, not uniformly well. There were losses, but they went extremely well. And so I don't think it's right to say that that's, you know, I don't see that issue becoming one that's sort of on the block. I think it's maintaining its ability to kind of appeal to different kinds of constituencies. In part, again, because the reach of the criminal justice system is so broad at this point. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find someone in America who's completely untouched by it. And certainly, you know, depending on race, people are much more likely to have been affected by it.
Yeah, so the follow-up question here from Jonathan, and I think you kind of touched on this there, but with the work that you've done, have you found that people really need to agree with what would broadly be defined as a sort of leftist set of social views in order to engage with this, or not? Because one of the things I was struck with is, broadly speaking, there were only two legislative achievements of the Trump presidency. One was tax cuts, and the other one was criminal justice reform, where there was actually a large bipartisan movement. So, you know, I think I put this in the prep document for you. Is this the last bipartisan issue in American politics, or is it? Do you feel like everyone you engage with is to the left of the political spectrum at the moment?
I don't know enough about the rest of politics to say if it's the last bipartisan issue in American politics. I think those things shift over every couple of years. So there's no last. I think that, yeah, again, there's just room to work on this on all points. So, I mean, I have to think that because that's, you know, where all energy is going. I guess I'll just say there's so much room to run here. There's ways to play at the county level, at the state level, and all different kinds of ways. I think a lot of particularly younger people are like, what are we doing with this? It seems a really, you know, weird way to invest. To go back to Los Angeles, they were going to build, estimates may vary, but roughly $3 billion men's mental health jail. Because as we all know, the best thing for someone in a mental health crisis is to put them in a heavily secure jail cell. And that was definitely going to happen as of 2017. And now that whole project is canceled, and now they're working on closing down the existing horrible men's central jail and not building a new one. That is really fast. There has been this huge shift. And I think part of it is around well, what kind of future does LA or any part of the country want? Do we want to invest billions upon billions and billions of dollars in building this brick and mortar, super depressing downer of an institution that causes all this harm? Or we could spend it on, health, well-being, care, safety, communities thriving, this other sorts of stuff. It's a much more positive, forward-looking thing to not be, throwing billions of dollars at prisons and jails. So I think that has some broad appeal as well. It's opportunity to thrive, and I think a lot of people are interested in that kind of message.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really interesting part, especially if we end up with divided government over the next couple of years, because you think about, well, where are the issues where you could see collaboration between two parties in a very polarized environment, and I wonder if this is one of them.
Yeah, let me just also to say more, because I don't think I said it clearly. I don't think you have to just be left in order to be for criminal justice reform in any stretch. I do think that the reason, people of different ideological persuasions will have a different analysis of what happens when you pull back this infrastructure, when you scale down the criminal justice system, what happens? And some people who might identify as more left might say, well, it's not going to be good unless you actually flood the zone with these types of social investments and supports. And then other people might say, no, that there'll be other sort of naturally occurring things, that opportunity just sort of springs forth and makes itself happen. But I think a lot of people can agree that, like, the metaphorical bombing of communities is not that great. And there are so many stories of people who you could pick thousands of stories of people who are like, no, I don't think that person should be sitting in a jail cell for 25 years. That's crazy.
Yes. Well, I think all of us on the call hope that there is legislative progress on this to reinforce that we've seen in the last couple of years. Lots of questions, I think, predictably, with our audience about places to give.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask, there are several different kind of nuances to this, which I'll go through over time. But I think the most common question is, where are you recommending that people donate right now to be most effective in your area of expertise?
Well, can I speak first? I want to speak to that, but I also want to speak to this thing of what can you do? Because this giving is a part of several actions that someone could take. So in addition to giving, and I'll come back to that, I have at least two, or sort of two or three like key recommendations I think other people may not have heard so much. First of all, I think most people who are getting excited about this issue have a very, very superficial understanding of it. They might have seen one movie or read a couple of articles or read The New Jim Crow, which is fantastic. Everyone should read The New Jim Crow. But particularly for sort of diligent, rigorous, effective altruism types who like to study, there's a need for more people who have some depth of knowledge. And I don't mean people to go be like super experts and devote their lives to it. Like, I mean, yes, more of those. And I've done nothing else for the past 15 years. But I mean, as someone trying to be helpful in the world, influencing your friends and your communities, and being able to kind of become a person that can exercise some amount of judgment. I think if people are really interested in this topic, it's a good idea to learn a lot. Like read 10 books, listen to, I'll put it in the chat, the Justice in America podcast is really good. There's a lot of episodes. You could listen to all of them or some, but it would be great if you devoted the time to listen to all of them. And then the people who are interesting, follow them on Twitter, amplify them, get some feel and some sense for it. Because also what I see happening, is people will glom onto an issue, for example, bail reform, which, as many of you might know, a lot of Americans are sitting in jail for lack of a relatively small amount of money. And if they had that money, they could bail out and keep their job and their house and their family. But because they don't have that money, they're sitting in jail, and it's really terrible. So people say, aha, we have to eliminate cash bail. But when you eliminate cash bail, it's not like, great, it's done. There's all these other complicated things that happen, like judges set other conditions. Now you're on probation, you have a probation fee. It's like complex. So I think if more people had a more kind of rounded, deeper sense of these matters, that would be positive, because then it wouldn't just be like a tiny cadre of people who understand anything trying to direct the excited mass of people who are now interested. It'd be good to have more like in between sort of amateur interested people who have like learned some amount of stuff. So I encourage people who are interested to immerse. A couple books I can recommend in addition to The New Jim Crow is The Collapse of American Criminal Justice, I'm putting in the chat, by my criminal procedure professor, and Golden Gulag by a very prominent abolitionist, Ruthie Gilmore. And there's more besides, but those two are great ones. The second,
yes, sorry, go on. I was going to say, fantastic recommendations.
And then there's plenty of documentaries as well. Some people like to listen, some like to watch, some like to read. There's, you know, The House I Live In is good. There's of course the 13th. There's all these sort of things to learn about. Although often the documentaries are more anecdotal. And so I think getting more systematic sense is good. The second thing I'd say in terms of volunteering, oftentimes organizations are not interested in random people trying to volunteer for them. It's kind of a lot of work to manage. Someplace where that isn't true though is around political campaigns. And maybe none of you have ever thought of volunteering for a political campaign, but these DA races, these district attorneys, a lot of them haven't run for office before. They don't have a bunch of cash and they don't have some cadre of like diligent, competent people to help them. So keeping an eye on that, for example, in Manhattan, there's an important DA race next year, in Philadelphia, and then there's these races, they're happening all over the country. A good organization, if you either want to figure out, I don't know how much they're absorbing volunteers, it's worth asking, but to give small dollars for political work in this area is Real Justice PAC. They've done some really, really strong work. There's other good organizations, but for like a one and done, loves to accept small dollar donations, knows what to do with them, Real Justice PAC. I'll put in a little plug for giving political dollars. In my own giving, my own charitable giving, I made a vow a couple of years ago not to do any more tax deductible giving, because I think that the leverage you can get with political dollars well placed, and I don't mean, you know, if you're spending it on multi-million dollar races, you know, your $1,000 is not going to make that much difference. But in these kinds of races, in a sheriff race, in a DA race early on, your whatever dollars does make a lot of difference. And so that's worth kind of thinking about. And then with respect to giving to other organizations, there's a lot of good ones. You've referred a couple of times to the memo that I did right after Minneapolis, which if you have handy, maybe put in the chat or send out after. I think basically that's a good list. It might be a little bit different. There's organizations that are good for criminal justice reform that maybe aren't on that list, but assuming someone's not trying, if you're trying to figure out how to spend $10 million, just contact me and I'll tell you. But if you're like, I've got $50, like just look at that list. It's fine. It's a great list. I think there are folks contributing a lot. I'd say my top #1 organization that I'm the most excited about is the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. Even though, and their focus is on ending incarceration for women and girls, which might seem niche because that's only 200,000 women and girls who are in jail and prison, as opposed to the larger number for everyone. But the way they do the work and what policies they're working on, it actually affects more than just women and girls, because there's a lot of policies where if you change that policy, you're not changing it just for women, you're changing it for everyone, including, for example, consideration of parental status when sentencing. Again, seems kind of niche, but I think it's quite brilliant, their work on that in Tennessee, because a lot of the reason why, what propels the system in part is this public sort of focus on this like episodic actions of people who were alleged to have committed some harm and there should be a consequence. Once you bring in, but think about like, these people are parents, they have families. This shifts how people are like thinking about the costs and benefits of using incarceration, perhaps excessively, because it's not just this individual who may be harmed, it's their kids and something else too. So I think that's important rhetorically. National Council has a really interesting, fully fledged strategy. They do organizing, they do cooperative businesses owned by formerly incarcerated women. They do a lot of interesting stuff. So I'm really particularly excited about them. And I'd also say that a lot it can be satisfying, and I think interesting to give where you are. Now, there are clusters of where people with resources live. And so if people only spent where they were, like the number of donors who just focus on San Francisco is kind of a lot to me, a bit excessive. But I think there's a benefit too of having some proximate connection to things. And if you felt like, combining, you could volunteer for a court watch and, give to that local court watch and just sort of get engaged locally. So I will leave it there. I think, again, if you're trying to give away some large amount of money, let's talk. But otherwise, I stand by that list. And pretty much, and all of our grantees as well. I think that it's an underfunded field, and even the larger organizations that have more money now, whose budgets are over $1 million, they are watching every dime. There's no kind of cushy, sitting on a lot of cash, organizations that we funded, at least. Otherwise, we wouldn't be funding them.
That's a great list of recommendations, Chloe. And guys, I know there were a lot of organizations in there, but we will distribute some materials afterwards. And I suppose Chloe's 2 points relate to each other, right? Which is, number one, we should strive to be more familiar with this space in order to understand all of these options better. But number two, once we're there, and even while we're getting there, we can give effectively. Obviously, a big part of the charities that One for the World recommends is very, very, very high standards of evidence. So our charities have to have multiple peer-reviewed randomized control trials, much harder to run in the area of criminal justice reform, probably functionally impossible to run in the area of criminal justice reform. But people have been asking, have you done any attempts yourself to try to quantify the cost effectiveness of giving in this area? And do you have any figures on that, or any idea of how we might compare it to other giving options in different cause areas?
Story of my life. It is hard to pin this stuff down, because a lot of what you're doing when you're doing organizing or political work or narrative shifting work is you're trying to create momentum and buzz and make something a thing. Like, I believe that our millions of dollars of investments in prosecutor work have made prosecutors a thing. They were not a thing when we started. And we did it by backing a number of organizations who work on that in different ways. Now, can I prove it to the extent where you would give me credit or give me a piece of every reform that every good prosecutor does in the country, or even ones that aren't newly elected but are getting with the program? That's tough. So I think that we can show, or last time we looked at it, I was with a lot of hedging and assumptions and, guessing that we were at around like 250x versus GiveWell, which is more like 1,000x. So if you're just like, according to Open Philanthropy, what's the place where I can put my dollar that does the most good? According to Open Phil, you should give to GiveWell, I think. That said, I would say, well, first of all, if you feel, like, look, now is the time. Now is a particularly unique and important time to be working on this, when there's a lot of traction. I think that puts thumb on the scale more towards this. Deworming was very important 10 years ago, will be very important in 10 years. I think that's different than this issue, where you have these moments where you can actually make a lot of change and where a boost of cash is good. And then second, that there's a lot that's not captured in that 250x, I would say. And third, that 250x is based on an assumption that a year of freedom from prison is worth $50,000 and a year of freedom from jail is worth $100,000. I think a jail bed gone empty for a year could be worth $250,000, for example. So I'm telling you all this. I don't say this to normal people. I have no idea what I'm talking about. But for EA folks, there's, I think we're closer to 1,000x than I've been able to show thus far. But if you want to be like, I'm helping the most that I can be certain about, yeah, for sure, go give your money to deworming. That's still probably true. Yeah, I guess I'll say that. The other thing I want to say, though, which feels somewhat related to this, is there's this notion that effective giving and social justice stuff doesn't really go together. because social justice is like about feelings or about wokeness, or it's squishy and all of that stuff. And I agree in the sense that there's a lot of, for example, social justice philanthropy that seems to me to be more about like, establishing one's like, good person credentials by backing certain types of things that look a certain way, including, a lot of like money to frontlines, Black democracy work. And I'm like looking at who they're funding and I'm like, these people are good people, but they're literally not on the front line. Like you're not actually being careful and specific enough about who you're backing. And I think that when you do drill down, there's a lot of really high impact work to fund. So I tend to come at a lot of sort of things that we funded might look like social justice things, but the route that I've taken to get there is a different kind of route. It's a question about leverage and impact and strategy, not giving from a sort of guilty place or about ethically, money should go in this different way, but to say, where are the undervalued assets in this field? Where are the leaders that could be amazing, but no one's really backed them? And if we found them and we could boost them up, they could do a lot of stuff. And when Los Angeles, it started with me meeting Patrisse Cullors, a co-founder of Black Lives Matter in 2017, and backing her in a way that she'd never been backed before. And I'd say roughly, you could say $3 million of investment produced $3 billion of impact or more in LA. Now, not every grant I do is like LA. That's why it sort of evens out across the portfolio. But I think there are particular ways to give that really can hold a candle to your sort of global health type giving, if you're really kind of pointed about it.
Yeah, I really want to echo that point, which is one of the key reasons that One for the World anchors at 1%, which can be a little controversial in effective giving, because it may be that we persuade people to give less. We don't think we do, but it's possible, is in order to encourage portfolio giving. And it's exactly what you just talked about, which is we are not of the mind that you have to concentrate just on one cause area or one type of giving. And we tend to recommend that you mix up some short-term and some long-term giving, some giving that's a bit more speculative. And the reason we recommend 1%, which is less than the average American gives to charity for global health and poverty, is you can be sure that that 1% is getting that 1,000x return that you were talking about. To people who are on the call, we are going to be sending around Chloe's recommendations, but she's also made the case very eloquently for some of our recommendations. I'm just going to launch a poll now. If you'd like to know more about the One for the World pledge, you can let us know there and we'll follow up with you after the call. While you're filling that out, there's quite a technical question here, but it indulges my nerdy interest in American politics. So someone said, given the results that happened down ballot with the particularly Democrats down ballot, do you think, has that shifted your view at all towards ballot measures, which actually proved sort of popular in a bipartisan way, sometimes in a way that you wouldn't expect given how they voted in actual electoral contests? Or are you still very focused on the election of legislators and prosecutors? So I wonder what.
So I assume that person is talking about Florida, where $15 minimum wage got over 60% of the vote, which you need in Florida to pass a ballot measure. Whereas Biden, of course, did not hit 50% in Florida, which some people found confusing, since the Dems have been more the party of increasing the minimum wage and what's going on there. There's like thousands of words being written at this very moment about that curiosity. It's not so perplexing to me. I think it's more about infrastructure and messaging, but leaving that aside, ballot measures can be great. Ballot measures are also really expensive. And if you don't hit it, you've kind of, you could stand to lose a lot. A bunch of donors put in to try to get a measure on the ballot in Arizona this year, which if it had been on the ballot, I think would have passed, given we see the results there. But they spent a lot of money, I don't know, at least over $1 million, maybe several $1 million, and it got attacked and failed on a legal challenge around the ballot language. So that's a bummer. Millions of dollars. I mean, that's a lot of money. Like you can do a lot with a couple $1 million. So that's really sort of like a trade-off thing. I'll also want to clarify something that we have not gotten involved in, nor have I recommended others to get involved in legislative races, in part because a legislator works on many issues and there may be contradicting kind of positions. We've tended to focus on prosecutor races, and others have focused on sheriff races or judicial races because you're getting a clean criminal justice issue rather than a lot of things kind of mixed up. And because there's not a lot of issues in there, you have less interested opposition on the other side. You don't have oil and gas companies coming in on the prosecutor races because it's not really going to affect them so much. Versus legislative races, everyone might be piling in and kind of racking up the cost. Now, law enforcement can make itself a well-funded opponent. They've got a lot of members who can put money in, and they spent over $5 million in Los Angeles to keep Jackie Lacey in office, but thankfully it wasn't enough. But for the most part, these are sort of good bang for buck kind of investments. Now, sometimes you have to go to the ballot because it just has to happen. Restoring voting rights to 1.4 million people in Florida was an example of that. Now, many of you may know it's been kind of a mess and a challenge, but I think it'll work itself out over time. And it's also revealed the way in which, fines and fees, like people can't vote because they don't have money. Doesn't that seem super undemocratic? Yes, it does. The last thing I'll say on ballots is that you don't have them everywhere. They're prolific in some places and just not part of the legal structure in other places. Or like in New York City, you can pass a local ballot measure, but it can be overturned by a simple majority vote of the city council, as they found with term limits several years ago. So it can be a good, sometimes a tactic, sometimes a strategy, depending on the place and how much money you have to accomplish what, just like everything.
I'd like to just pick up on something that's been a common theme in some of the questions here, which is about momentum. So 2020 has been unprecedented for the mobilization behind criminal justice reform and I suppose awareness of racial inequity in the States and around the world. And one thing I would point people to on this is that Chloe and her colleagues published something on movement building, and it's quite long, but I would really recommend reading it because it has some really interesting analysis of how social movements grow and how momentum ebbs and flows in there and where you can intervene as a funder. So I'd really, really, really recommend that. But Chloe, just picking up on these questions, how do you see the challenge of maintaining momentum, particularly in light of the election last week, where it feels like some of the democratic momentum has been halted a bit, and the fact that we're probably not going to have a year like 2020 again, at least for a few years.
Or I hope we never have a year like 2020 ever again.
Yeah, fair, yeah.
To be clear.
Yeah,
a lot of people have died this year, but I think, my colleague and grantee and friend, Carlos Saavedra and Paul Engler, who designed a whole training called Momentum that I attended before starting this job that had the movement ecology piece in it, about which I wrote in the SSA article, which is actually one of 3 articles, and they wrote the other 2. And they are the authors of that report we're talking about. Subsequent to publishing that report, they delved deep into this concept of the seasons, winter, spring, summer, fall, talking about how we have seasons in our individual leadership, organizational leadership, and on the level of movement. Winter, frozen, cold, not much happening, but you can plan, you can rest, you can figure out what you want to grow. Spring, young green shoots, the heat is coming back. Summer, go, 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 lots of heat, lots of power. And then in the fall, it's cooling down, but you have your harvest. So imagine this as a cycle for movement. And they've plotted out, in fact, civil rights movement, other movements, these seasons, and they come again. Winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall. It keeps going. So, and if you're lucky, your winters are short and your summers are productive and you get good harvests. There's a tendency to want to just hold on to summer. We're in summer, let's make it last. And if you can map it to some sense of growing things, of course you had endless summer. I mean, everything just gets cooked. Once the seeds have grown, they've grown, and you harvest your fruit, and then the plant is kind of tired and done, and the soil needs to replenish, and you need new ideas. You might want to move your garden a little bit, plant some different things. Just so movement and this desire to kind of keep it going and hold on and keep it hot is a bit counterproductive. In fact, if you want to achieve a goal that is really different from how the world looks right now, you're going to need a couple of full movement cycles to get there, a couple of good summers, or maybe more, maybe 10 good summers to achieve something really big. You're not going to do it all in one summer. And so, as Carlos says, respect your winters. on the personal, organizational, and movement level, because they're a chance to really learn, reflect, plan, train, and sort of launch the next phase of things instead of trying to just hold on to momentum forever. I think people tend to experience the cooling off as a really sad, mournful time, and it means just it's never going to come again. But as I mentioned earlier on the call, we had Ferguson, and then it's like, oh no, we're losing the momentum. And then it's still there. The conditions are still there. They haven't changed. That's why this is an issue worth working on. You know, like the fundamental reality of the relationship of sort of racial hierarchy encouraged by and sort of perpetuated by the state with state violence continues. And so there will be another summer. So it's actually like, the point is ride the momentum, take your harvest, retreat and plan, and come forth again, is part of the message that I get from those folks. And I think you see that reflected in that report. Thanks for plugging it. I agree. It's a really great one.
Well, that's a pleasure. And that is, I think, an excellent point to end on, that note of hope and optimism, that even if summer does not last forever, it will come again. Chloe, I had really, really, really high levels of excitement about this webinar because I think it's super interesting to talk about effective giving in the context of the real world, where people are incredibly passionate and motivated about things that are hard to measure, about things that are cyclical or seasonal, and don't want to do all of their giving in one place. And yet, even despite those high expectations, I really think you exceeded them. So thank you so much for joining us. I would have been happy to talk to you for another hour, but I want to be respectful of your time.
Well, I could talk about this stuff for 12 hours. It's a dare. Well, thank you for having me on, and thanks for what you're doing. I really think this framing around 1% is really helpful. I think it gets people to just acknowledge and realize that if they care about something, they should put at least some of their bucks behind it, particularly at the higher levels, but at all levels across. I think actually people with less cash tend to be much more generous than those with more. But I think it's good to set a kind of cultural standard around a certain level of giving, and then people need to get on board with that. So I really appreciate that. And to the people I can't see but who've been asking questions, thank you so much for taking the time to listen. And if you think of questions after or have brilliant points to make, you know, I suppose send them to Jack and he'll get them to me, and we can continue to engage. But I really appreciate it. It's an amazing opportunity to do this work, and there's such great stuff happening, but it's not really going to work without a lot more people coming in and picking up the baton and running with it. So I appreciate your interest.
Fantastic. Well, Chloe, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who joined us. We only have one more event in this season of webinars, but we will be launching them again in the spring, and I'm sure we'll have Chloe back in the future. If you would like to join us for our last event, it's on Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern time, and we have world-renowned bioethicist Peter Singer joining us as we donate our $1 millionth to charity from the members of One for the World. So look out for that on our website. Thanks again to Chloe, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening.
Cheers all.